Now today's parable is a parable of the yeast. Jesus also used this illustration. The kingdom of heaven is like the yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she put only a little yeast and 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. Throughout most of the gospel, Jesus is telling parables to his followers. Each of these parables has an important lesson for those that follow God. Jesus tells us the parable of the yeast. In Matthew 13:33, the parable of the yeast told by Jesus goes like this. Jesus also used this illustration. The kingdom is like the yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she put on a little yeast and 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. This parable is also sometimes referred to as the parable of the leaven. Of course, to understand this parable, we must first know what yeast or leaven does. Yeast is a fermented dough, and a small amount is added to more dough when baking. A little bit of yeast alone will cause the dough to rise, which is how bread is made into larger loaves. The parable of yeast is a parable about the kingdom of heaven. The yeast represents the kingdom of heaven, and the dough is the world. The yeast slowly grows into something much larger like the kingdom of heaven. The example of yeast as the kingdom of heaven is very similar to the parable of the mustard seed, where the kingdom of heaven is also represented by something small that grows into something large. In the parable of yeast, it is also important to note that yeast and leaven is unnoticeable when added to the dough. The kingdom of heaven is likewise a growth that you can't see happening, but it is happening. If it seems at times like God isn't present in the world around you, and don't get discouraged because the kingdom of heaven is almost growing. Another difference in the parable of the yeast and the parable of the mustard seed is that in the parable of the mustard seed, Jesus just says that the kingdom of heaven will grow to larger size. In the parable of the yeast, Jesus says that the yeast will permeate every part of the dough. If the yeast represents the kingdom of heaven and the dough represents the world, then Jesus is saying that the kingdom of heaven will grow until everyone is touched. In order for the kingdom of heaven to grow, we can all do our own part. We should be like both the yeast and the dough. On the one hand, we should all be the dough, with the yeast the kingdom of heaven permeating within us. On the other hand, we should always also be the yeast in the dough, that is the world, and help the kingdom of heaven permeate throughout the world. And I thank you for listening to my parable.